People all over the world experience violence, hunger, and trauma, impacting their health and well-being and those of the generations that follow. There's famine in Gaza. There's famine in Sudan. And there is hunger around the world. Such a basic need for food and water not being met, losing the lives of children as pawns in violence, is heartbreaking. It is the most vulnerable who experience famine, almost always due to war, and or people with power being willing to let human beings suffer and die to protect that power. Students across the United States and now around the world are demonstrating at their universities, demanding divestment of their schools from Israel. Whether we agree with that approach, in a quintessentially American move, our media and many politicians have made the protests all about us. Our rules around free speech and debating about the language in student handbook policies at private colleges, rather than talking about what's actually happening in Gaza. My father-in-law has been riveted to the news more than usual, watching the protests and the response. He flips around to different networks, and the coverage is often infuriating. Instead of spending time on the talks in Egypt or the politics and stories on the ground in Israel and Gaza, or aid, or even what the impact of student demands could be, it's been endless coverage of, quote, unrest, riots, and who's leading the students to do what. Someone asked me recently about resources that the Unitarian Universalist Association might have for a position on and understanding of the war in Gaza. Our UUA president, Reverend Dr. Sophia Betancourt, has put out a number of statements, as have the UUA staff, calling for an immediate ceasefire. You can read the statements at uua.org. We also have a tool in the proposed updated language for our shared Unitarian Universalist values in the statement about love that we read earlier. Love is the power that holds us together and is at the center of our shared values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. In a sermon a couple of months ago, I mentioned that I hear echoes in our shared values of the language of our theologian, James Luther Adams. As a reminder, he wrote, "The love of God, then, is the giving of oneself to the power that holds the world together, and that when we are tearing it apart, persuades us to come to ourselves and start on new beginnings." We human beings do tear the world apart. And so in our shared values is an emphasis on accountability. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. What are some aspects of a spiritual discipline of love we could lean into? We have guides in our principles and also in the new language of Article 2. Love is at the center of our shared values, which include interdependence, equity, transformation, pluralism, generosity, and justice. These values are part of a spiritual discipline of love. For me, love is grounded in interdependence through compassion and empathy. We are all interconnected, but sometimes we can go through life as if that were not true. And empathy helps us to feel that web of interconnection with our whole beings. Practices of interconnection, compassion, and empathy lead us away from dehumanization, othering, and xenophobia. Adrienne Marie Brown reflects on love and interdependence in our reading this morning. If the goal was to increase the love rather than winning or dominating a constant opponent, I think we could actually imagine liberation from constant oppression. We would be suddenly seeing everything we do, everyone we meet, not through the tactical eyes of war, but through eyes of love. We would see that there's no such thing as a blank canvas, an empty land, or a new idea, but everywhere there is complex, ancient, fertile ground full of potential. A spiritual discipline of love might seem simple on its surface, but when we follow the threads and interconnection from within each of us to each other, and then to all that is, it becomes complicated and sometimes fraught. How do we face tragedy, violence, and loss with love? This is a fundamental question in Unitarian Universalism and in most faith traditions. Love is the power that persuades us to come back to ourselves and begin again. There's not an easy answer of how to achieve peace in the Middle East or how to live an accountable spiritual discipline of love. But I do know that in the practice, in the struggle toward love and liberation, there is growth and there is often healing. There is repair and compassion in a practice of love. All of us and all the matter around us are made of stardust and life. We are part of a miracle of being, sharing this place with an infinite web of relationships. When our practice brings us to pay attention to that radical interconnection with all that is, it's easier to find and hold love, and sometimes easier for our hearts to be broken. And that's why we need each other. We are a strand among infinite strands, impacted by one another and holding each other up. Our call to live into love as a spiritual discipline isn't just to be nice or because love feels good or is good, but because cultivating more love in the world strengthens the web and plants seeds toward liberation and justice. I don't know why we haven't been able to get it together as human beings to be sure that basic things like food and water and shelter are available to all people, other than greed and callousness, and that the power toward othering people and dehumanizing is strong. Historic shifts in culture have happened when there have been people transformed and inspired by love, willing to put themselves on the line to protect the vulnerable and stand up against injustice. A spiritual discipline of love can help us navigate the day-to-day and help us in the face of larger challenges. In response to the suffering in Gaza, we can work in different ways to encourage our government to apply pressure on Israel and Hamas, to stop harming civilians, and to get aid to those who need it. In the face of rising anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hate here in the United States, we can lean on our spiritual discipline of love and do what we can to help protect Jewish and Muslim communities here at home and around the world. What if we made our decisions and grounded our practices in the challenge of a spiritual discipline of love, compassion, and interconnection in an imperfect world? We might imagine liberation from constant oppression. We would be suddenly seeing everything we do, everyone we meet, not through the tactical eyes of war, but through eyes of love. Love is that power that holds us together. May we all experience that love, and as an interconnected global community, May we practice and increase love, and may we protect the vulnerable. So may it be, and amen.